The bells of Venice did not merely ring, they trembled through the air like whispers from another age. John stood at the edge of the canal and watched the water catch the morning light, gilded ripples folding into one another, as though the city itself was composed of dreams rather than stone. It was his first week in this place, yet he felt an odd recognition, as though he had lived in the echo of these narrow streets long before he ever walked them. The gondolas slid past like fragments of a forgotten procession. Their black hulls shone, polished by years of patient service, and the men who guided them carried a gravity in their gestures, as if they too were keepers of secrets. John let his gaze follow the curve of the Grand Canal until it vanished between palaces painted with time, facades wary yet proud, their windows opening like eyes that had seen centuries of longing. He had come to Venice in search of nothing he could name. A friend had spoken of its beauty, another had urged him to see Florence instead, but John felt no allegiance to travel advice. Something in his heart had whispered for Venice, and he obeyed. Now the city greeted him with its peculiar mixture of silence and song, of grandeur and decay, and he found himself unable to tell where his own thoughts ended and where the city's began. He walked each morning without destination. The alleys twisted like puzzles, but he never grew impatient. If he turned a corner and found himself lost, it was only another gift, an unexpected square, a quiet bridge, a courtyard where laundry swayed in the sea breeze. The city seemed to conspire with him, creating small surprises, as if to remind him that life was not made for calculation, but for discovery. One evening he lingered on a bridge as dusk gathered. The water beneath carried the reflection of lanterns that had just been lit, trembling sparks caught in the current. He felt a strange stirring inside him then, not yet love, not yet desire, but a kind of readiness, as though his heart knew a figure would soon enter this stage, and the waiting itself was already sweet. The Venetians walked past him without notice, their voices mingling in soft Italian cadences. But John remained apart, listening more to the silence than to the sound. He thought of his life before Venice, the rooms of London with their gray light, the conversations that felt rehearsed, the obligations that pressed like weights on the soul. Here all that dissolved. Venice was not interested in duty or career. Venice spoke only of beauty, and beauty had a way of making nonsense feel like truth. Sometimes he smiled at himself. What was he doing, drifting through canals, thinking like a poet when he was no such thing? Yet he could not resist. Even the pigeons on the steps of San Marco seemed to walk with a certain poetry, scattering at a child's laughter as though rehearsing a ballet. He told himself it was nonsense, and yet he knew that nonsense might be the one thing worth listening to. On his third day he stepped into a small church, half hidden from the main street. It was nearly empty, only an old woman muttering her prayers in a corner. But the place was alive with shadows, with the scent of candles, with frescoes that peeled yet still clung to their colors. He sat for a long while, gazing at an angel whose face had faded into near nothingness. In that incomplete figure he felt something whole, a reminder that even broken things could carry grace. When he left, the air of the city seemed altered. The bells had begun again, and their notes folded into the chatter of the piazzas. John's steps felt lighter, as though Venice had slipped a key into his pocket, unlocking a door he had not known was closed. He did not yet know her name, the woman who would change everything, but he sensed she was already walking somewhere in this labyrinth, waiting for the moment when their paths would meet. He first saw her when the morning was soft with mist, and the canals seemed to hover between waking and dream. A gondola had drifted under the bridge where John leaned, its prow slipping like a shadow across the water, and there she sat, a book closed on her lap, her eyes not upon the page, but upon the city that slid past her. The meeting was no more than a glance, Yet it carried something that disturbed the calm he had made for himself. She had looked upward and caught his gaze, and the moment lingered even after the gondola had vanished from sight. For hours afterward he thought of little else. He told himself it was chance, a fleeting encounter that meant nothing. Yet in his heart he knew the city was playing its old tricks, setting a stage for actors who had not known their parts until the curtain lifted. Venice had that way about her, weaving strangers into patterns as if she were composing music. He wandered through the alleys with a restless step, wondering if he would see her again, pretending he did not wish it while longing that he would. It was the next day in a small square that he saw her once more. She stood before a fountain where children splashed their hands in the shallow basin, tossing coins with a seriousness that only children can hold. She watched them with a quiet smile, and John found himself moving toward her without thought. He could not say what courage carried him forward, for he was not bold by nature. Yet when their eyes met again, he spoke as though the words had waited long within him. He asked her if she believed the children's wishes might ever come true, and she laughed, not unkindly, but with a softness that gave the question dignity. She said perhaps wishes were not meant to be judged, only cherished, for it is the cherishing that makes them real. The answer struck him as more than playful, and so they began to speak, slowly at first, then with the ease of two souls who had been waiting for conversation to arrive. Her name was Jill. She told it simply, as if it carried no weight. Yet John felt at once that the syllables belonged to him now, a secret he would repeat silently when she was gone. They walked together through the square, past the vendors calling their wares, and the old men bent over their chessboards, and their words flowed like water, unhurried, finding their own course. He learned she was traveling with her father, though she spoke of him with a distance that suggested absence even in presence. She had come to Venice for the season, but she confessed she did not care much for society, preferring the corners where the city whispered its own stories. The hours slipped away. He showed her a bridge from which the sunset poured into the canal like molten gold, and she showed him a courtyard where ivy hung thick as a tapestry over the walls. Each discovery seemed to belong to them alone, though countless others had passed the same places before. That was the enchantment of Venice. It made old stones new when two hearts looked upon them together. There were silences, but they were not empty. Sometimes they walked without speech, listening to the lap of water or the sudden cry of a gull overhead, and John felt those silences as intimate as words. Yet beneath the ease of their companionship stirred a current of uncertainty. He wondered if her kindness sprang only from courtesy, if tomorrow she would forget him as easily as she had found him. And she, though she did not say it, wondered whether this stranger was only a companion for the day, a figure who would fade once her gondola carried her into another corner of the city. Still, the days began to gather around them. They met again, and again, as though chance itself had taken their side. With each meeting John felt the threads tighten, drawing him into an affection he dared not name. He saw it in the way her laughter carried a note reserved only for him, in the way her eyes brightened when he spoke of things that mattered little to others. Venice seemed to conspire further, arranging the lights so it fell upon her face like a benediction, arranging the tides so their reflections touched side by side in the water. And yet, with every moment of closeness, there was also the whisper of distance. She never spoke fully of her life, and he never asked too boldly. The air between them was charged with the sweetness of beginnings, but also with the fragility of things that may not last. John walked her once to her lodging, a grand old palazzo whose door was carved with lions, and there he paused, reluctant to let the evening end. She bid him good night with a smile, and though he longed to take her hand, he did not. He watched the door close and stood for long minutes afterward, his heart caught between hope and hesitation. The days that had been so light began to take on a weight John could not ignore. What had started as simple delight in Jill's company was now shadowed by the knowledge that others were watching, and that those others had expectations far stronger than the impulses of two wandering hearts. For Venice had seemed to belong only to them, a city suspended outside the rules of the world. But life has a way of reasserting itself, of reminding lovers that every dream has its morning after. Jill's father was a man of presence, a figure who carried with him the assurance of class and station. He did not appear often when John and Jill met, but his absence was never complete. It lingered like a weight in Jill's voice whenever she spoke of home, or like a line drawn across the pavement where John dared not step. To her father, Venice was not a playground of affections, but a stage for reputation. The acquaintances he maintained, the dinners to which he escorted his daughter, the letters he sent back to England, all these were currencies in the world of society, where names and positions mattered more than joy. Jill felt this pressure even when she tried to set it aside. She laughed with John in the mornings and walked with him through hidden gardens, but when she returned to the palazzo, the echo of her father's voice undid her ease. He would ask where she had been, in tones polite yet edged with command. He would remind her of invitations accepted, of families they must meet, of the kind of life expected of her when they returned to London. The reminders were subtle, but their force was unrelenting. John, for his part, could not pretend blindness. He knew he did not belong to Jill's world. His family was comfortable enough, but not of that circle where influence flowed as naturally as wine at supper. He was a man of books, of quiet observation, not a player in the grand game of alliances. And though Jill never spoke of it directly, he saw in her the conflict, an affection for him that deepened with every glance, yet a fear that to name it openly would be to tear herself in two. The contrast between them was made sharper by the very city they loved. Venice, with its palaces and faded grandeur, was itself a symbol of what happens when glory and reality collide. Once the seat of power and wealth, now it stood as a relic, beautiful but precarious, held together by memory more than strength. John often thought of this when he looked at Jill across a gondola, her face lit by lamplight. She was like Venice, graceful, luminous, yet bound by a history she could not escape. There were evenings when society claimed her entirely. John would walk by the palazzo and see carriages waiting, torches lighting the marble steps, the sound of music drifting from within. He imagined her there, dressed in silks, speaking with men whose fortunes were written in ships and estates. He told himself it was nonsense to hope she might think of him in such moments, yet hope persisted. He would walk the canals alone, watching the reflections break under his steps, and wonder if he was a fool to believe that affection could stand against expectation. Jill, too, lay awake on those nights, staring at the ceiling while the voices of guests echoed faintly through the walls. She thought of John's smile, the way his words carried no calculation, and her heart ached with the simplicity of it. With him she was not her father's daughter, not a figure in a social tableau, but only herself, unadorned, unmeasured. Yet when dawn came, she rose and dressed in the manner expected of her, because she could not bear to disappoint a father who loved her in his own stern way, or to risk the judgment of a world that showed little mercy to women who strayed beyond its lines. The struggle grew within her like a tide. She found herself torn between the thrill of her meetings with John and the cold hand of obligation waiting afterward. She had moments of rebellion, when she told herself she would follow her own desire and let the world talk as it pleased. But then she remembered her mother's early death, the years of sacrifice her father had borne, the pride he held so tightly. To wound him felt unthinkable. Yet to let John drift from her life felt unbearable. It was in this tension that their love began to change. No longer the lightness of chance meetings. It carried a depth edged with sorrow. They both knew that society stood like a barrier before them, and that every step forward would be tested by the weight of expectation. The conflict that had for so long hidden in the shadows now pressed itself upon them with the weight of inevitability. No longer could John imagine that chance would resolve it. No longer could Jill believe that the sweetness of their days together was safe from the eyes of the world. The very air between them seemed charged with the tension of choice, and each meeting carried with it the knowledge that love, if it is to live, must sooner or later declare itself against duty. John found no rest in his thoughts. The streets of Venice, once his delight, now became mirrors of his unrest. He walked the arcades of the Rialto and saw nothing but the faces of men who knew their place in life, merchants counting coins, boatmen calling their prices, citizens content in their routine. He envied them their simplicity. For him, every step was haunted by the question of Jill. Should he speak? Should he claim her with the full force of his devotion? Or should he step aside, allowing her to move unburdened into the life her father had chosen? At night he lay awake in the small room he had taken, staring at the rafters as if the beams themselves might give answer. He thought of her smile, the light in her eyes when she spoke of the smallest things, the way her laughter softened the harshness of the world. To lose that seemed unbearable. Yet he also thought of the heaviness in her silence when her father's name was mentioned, the way her expression faltered at the edges whenever the future was spoken of. She was bound, and he feared that to demand her freedom might crush her as surely as surrendering it. Venice itself seemed to know their plight. The city grew dreamlike, as though it had been summoned not from stone and water, but from the fever of his own mind. The canals shimmered with strange colors at dusk, and the facades leaned toward him with faces that whispered of destiny. He could not walk through a square without feeling the weight of centuries bearing down, as if all the loves that had been lost here before were pressing him toward the same conclusion. Even the bells that marked the hours seemed to toll not merely for time, but for fate, calling out that choice could not be delayed forever. Jill moved through these days with a quiet bravery that only deepened his longing. She spoke with him still in the corners of the city, but her words carried a wistfulness that betrayed her struggle. Sometimes she would look away suddenly, as though afraid her eyes might reveal more than her lips could hide. She told him once that she dreamed of freedom, not in grand escapes or rebellions, but in the simple freedom of walking where her heart wished without thought of what others might say. He heard in those words the cry of a soul trapped, and his hands trembled with the desire to take her away from it all. There were moments when he nearly spoke. On the steps of a deserted church, he almost declared that love was greater than duty, that the heart must rule where tradition would bind. His lips parted, but he faltered, for she looked at him, then with such a fragile dignity that he dared not break it. Another time, on a gondola gliding under the Bridge of Sighs, he nearly seized her hand and swore he would not let her go. Yet he did not, for she turned her gaze upon the prison windows that shadowed the water, and he knew that love, if forced, might become a prison too. The city conspired with his turmoil. Mists rose more thickly from the lagoons, cloaking the domes and spires in a veil that seemed drawn from dreams. Lanterns burned with halos that blurred their edges, and in their glow Jill appeared less a woman than a vision, untouchable, half-spirit. John wondered whether Venice herself had created her, an embodiment of beauty destined only to vanish with the tide. Such thoughts left him trembling, for if she were indeed no more than a dream, then what place was left for his devotion? And yet, through all this uncertainty, love did not fade. It sharpened, deepened, grew like fire in the grate that flares higher when starved of air. Every restraint, every silence, only added to its intensity. John felt himself consumed, his every act measured against her presence or absence. He could not write a letter without hearing her voice in the words, could not taste a glass of wine without wondering if she too was dining, perhaps thinking of him. Love had become not a part of his life, but the very pulse of it, and he was powerless before it. Jill too felt this burning, though she hid it with the grace women learn when society grants them no other shield. She sat through her father's dinners, nodding politely to men who spoke of politics or trade, but all the while her mind wandered back to John. The contrast was cruel: the gilded halls, the endless talk of fortunes, the shallow compliments offered with practiced smiles. Then the memory of John's quiet earnestness, his way of listening, as though her thoughts mattered more than anything else in the world. She returned from those evenings, exhausted, her heart aching with the knowledge of what she must deny. It seemed to her at times that the whole city was complicit in their struggle. The pigeons scattered in the square like messengers of unease. The tides rose with a restlessness that mirrored her own, and the gondoliers sang songs that sounded like laments. Venice was no longer simply a city of beauty. It had become a mirror of their hearts, reflecting love and sorrow in every stone. She felt that if she were to leave, the waters themselves would rise to hold her back. Yet if she stayed, they might drown her. The moment could not be postponed any longer. All the wandering hours in Venice, the quiet meetings under bridges and in shaded squares, had led them here, to the edge where love must either claim its right or be swept away. The pressure of family and the murmurs of society closed around them like tightening walls, and both John and Jill knew that silence would no longer protect them. Her father had grown restless with her absences. He questioned her more sharply now, no longer with the polite curiosity of a parent, but with the authority of a man who guarded his name and standing. He spoke of future alliances, of families whose influence could not be ignored, of opportunities that must not be squandered. To him, marriage was no mere affair of the heart, but a contract that bound wealth to wealth, name to name, and Jill's hesitation was beginning to wound his pride. He warned her of impropriety, of the whispers that would follow if she persisted in keeping company with one beneath their station. And though he did not name John, the implication hung in every word. John felt the tightening of the noose as keenly as she. He saw how her step grew heavier, how her laughter, once so ready, faltered before it reached her lips. He knew the cause, yet he could not offer her freedom without tearing himself apart. He walked the city in long, restless strides, and at last he resolved that the time for restraint was past. If he did not speak now, if he did not lay his heart before her plainly, he would lose her not to indifference, but to the slow erosion of silence. They met at dusk on the steps of a deserted campo. The last light of day still touched the tops of the palaces, but the square lay already in shadow. John took her hands, trembling, and spoke with a fervor that startled even himself. He told her that love was no accident, no game of chance, but the one truth that made life bearable. He confessed that every hour apart from her was emptiness, that every breath he drew was bound to the thought of her. He asked not for duty, not for obedience, but only for the courage to let her heart choose freely. Jill listened, and the tears in her eyes were both joy and sorrow. She loved him, she did not deny it. She confessed that his words echoed her own thoughts, that she too had found in him the only peace she had ever known. Yet she trembled with fear, for she knew the cost. To follow him meant to wound her father, to invite the scorn of a society that would brand her ungrateful, reckless, perhaps even lost. She told him that love may be truth, but truth does not always triumph against the world. Their voices broke into silence then, and for a long while they sat without speech, hearing only the water lapping against the stones. The weight of decision hung in the air, heavier than any chain. John longed to seize her, to pull her into his arms, and vow that he would protect her against all the judgments of the world. Yet even in his passion, he felt the cruelty of forcing her into rebellion. He saw her face pale with conflict, and he knew that if he pressed too hard he might destroy what he most sought to preserve. It was Jill who at last spoke, her voice quiet yet steady. She told him that love, if it is to endure, must find a way not only through desire but through sacrifice. She said that perhaps the world calls it nonsense to believe that two hearts can stand against the tide, but nonsense itself may carry a wisdom deeper than all the clever calculations of society. She asked him to trust her, to believe that even if the path ahead seemed impossible, their love would not vanish. For what is love, she said, if not the one beautiful nonsense that makes the rest of life worth enduring? In that moment John felt both broken and exalted. Broken, because he knew she might choose her duty over him. Exalted, because her words lifted love above the petty measures of respectability. He realized that nonsense was not folly but freedom, a defiance of the world's heavy arithmetic. If society called them foolish, then let them be fools, for the wisdom of the heart is older than any law. The night deepened, and they rose together, walking slowly through the silent streets. They said little, for words had already reached their limit. The decision still lay before them, sharp and unavoidable, but a strange calm settled over John. Whatever came, he knew their love had already transformed the meaning of his life. It might lead to loss, it might lead to exile, but it would never be forgotten, never be diminished. Venice itself seemed to acknowledge the moment. The lanterns shone more brightly than before, the waters gleamed with a peculiar stillness, as though the city wished to preserve in memory the two figures who walked its stones with hearts ablaze. And John, for all his turmoil, felt that he had touched something eternal, something no decree of family or society could take away. The choice once made could not be undone, and its echoes traveled through their lives like the bells of the city that rang long after the clapper had stilled. The air of Venice seemed different now, not lighter nor darker, but filled with a new gravity, as though the stones themselves carried the memory of what had passed between them. John walked the narrow alleys with the knowledge that nothing would ever be as it was before. And Jill moved through her days with the quiet dignity of one who had given something precious away and yet kept its essence hidden in her heart. The city watched them both. The palaces, whose windows looked down with wary eyes, had seen countless such stories unfold, and perhaps for this reason they did not mock, but seemed almost to console. The waters, too, reflected their moods, sometimes restless, sometimes calm, as if mirroring the tides of their souls. Venice became not only the stage of their love, but also its witness, carrying within its ancient silence the record of their joy and sorrow. For John there was at first the ache of loss, sharp and unrelenting. To walk past the palazzo where she lived was to feel both pride and torment. Pride that he had once been admitted to her confidences, torment that the doors were now closed against him. He tried to fill the hours with the distractions of the city, the galleries, the music, the endless flow of strangers, but every sound returned him to her voice, and every vision seemed incomplete without her presence. Yet slowly, almost imperceptibly, the pain began to transform. He came to understand that love, though denied in one form, could still endure in another. He no longer demanded possession. He sought instead remembrance. Each bridge they had crossed together became a sacred place, each shadowed street a scripture of what they had shared. In this way Venice herself became Jill, and by loving the city he could still love her without transgression. Jill too bore her burden with quiet strength. In her father's company she was composed, even dutiful, but when she was alone she allowed herself the tenderness of memory. She thought of John not with bitterness, but with gratitude. For he had revealed to her a truth she had scarcely believed possible, that the heart may speak with greater wisdom than all the counsels of society. Though she yielded to duty, she did not yield her soul, and in that defiance lay her freedom. In time, both came to see that what the world called nonsense was in truth the deepest form of sense. Respectability demanded conformity, calculation, advantage. But love asked for nothing and gave everything. To those who measured life in contracts and alliances, such love seemed foolish. Yet to those who had tasted it, even for a brief season, it was the only thing that made the rest endurable. So it was that the city itself seemed to close around them with a gentleness that belied its age. The autumn mists softened the outlines of domes and towers. The bells carried their melancholy across the lagoons, and the pigeons wheeled above the square as if enacting some eternal dance. Venice became both tomb and cradle, burying the form of their love yet preserving its spirit. John, in his wanderings, began to see the city less as a place of loss than as a teacher. Its faded palaces, still magnificent though touched by decay, taught him that beauty need not be perfect to endure. Its waters, ever shifting, taught him that nothing remains unchanged, yet all things leave their trace. And its silences, profound and lingering, taught him that even what is unsaid may carry more truth than words. Jill learned, too. She discovered that obedience to duty need not extinguish the flame of the heart, provided one carried that flame within as a hidden light. She walked with others in society's halls, but beneath her smile lived a secret knowledge, a certainty that she had once known love in its purest form. That certainty, far from making her bitter, lent her a serenity that others mistook for composure, but which was in truth remembrance. Thus the story reached not a triumph nor a tragedy, but something in between, a conclusion that defied the neatness of endings. They did not marry, nor did they forget. They did not conquer society, nor were they wholly conquered by it. Instead, they discovered that life, in all its contradictions, can be born if one carries within the heart the knowledge of beauty once encountered. And so nonsense revealed itself to be not folly but revelation. The world may sneer at it, yet without it life is gray and heavy, a ledger of duties without music. With it, even loss becomes luminous, and sorrow takes on the dignity of love. John came to see this clearly as he prepared at last to leave Venice. Standing upon the deck of the boat that would carry him away, he looked back upon the domes and towers dissolving in the mist. He knew he left behind more than a city, he left a chapter of his very soul. Yet he also carried it within him, indestructible, because love, once lived, becomes eternal in memory. The city grew quieter as the season turned. The songs of the gondoliers drifted more faintly across the water, and the piazzas emptied earlier each evening, as if Venice herself had grown weary of pretending to be eternal. John stood often by the lagoon, watching the tide carry fragments of light away from the shore, and he felt in its ebby and flow the echo of his own heart. What had been fierce longing had become something gentler, a love transfigured into memory, a flame that burned not to consume but to illumine. Jill he saw no more, save at a distance when her father's carriage rolled through the square, or when she stepped, composed and graceful, into the company of others. Yet even from afar he sensed her awareness of him, a glance that lingered an instant longer than chance would allow, a silence that held within it all the words they could no longer speak. They lived now as two souls walking parallel paths, close enough to hear each other's footsteps, yet bound to remain apart. Venice became their confidante. Its bridges held their secrets, its churches absorbed their prayers, Its canals whispered back the truth they dared not voice aloud. And the city, with its centuries of love and betrayal, of triumph and ruin, wrapped them both in a silence that was neither cruel nor kind, but deeply human. It was as though the city itself spoke to them, saying, "Such is life, such is love, such is the beautiful nonsense that gives meaning to it all." When at last John prepared to depart, he lingered on the deck as the boat slipped from its moorings. The domes of San Marco glowed in the fading sun, and the bells tolled across the water, heavy and resonant. He knew he was leaving behind not merely a city, not merely a love, but a chapter of his soul. Yet he also understood that departure did not erase what had been lived. Love, once kindled, does not vanish. It changes its form, finding refuge in memory, in the unseen chamber of the heart where time holds no dominion. For Jill, life would go on within the boundaries of duty. But in the quiet hours she would remember him, and in those memories she would be free. Society might claim her days, but her nights belonged to her heart, and in that secret domain John would live forever, not as a shadow, but as a truth more enduring than possession. So it was that their story ended not with a wedding nor with despair, but with something more delicate and more profound. They had discovered that love cannot always conquer the world, yet it can redeem it. They had learned that nonsense, when born of beauty and devotion, may in the end be the truest wisdom. And Venice remained behind them, timeless and patient, a city of water and stone, but also of dreams. To those who came after, it would offer the same gift: the chance to lose oneself, the chance to discover love, the chance to realize that in the heart's foolishness lies the only truth worth carrying. So the tale closed, not with certainty, but with acceptance. Life would go on with its demands, its compromises, its reckonings. Yet for John and Jill, there would always be Venice. There would always be that season when two souls met and recognized in each other the music the world calls folly, but which the heart knows as the most beautiful sense of all.